Welcome. It is a fabulous Friday night. I am Frances Henderson, and I am the chair of the People of Color Caucus of SEWSA. Welcome this evening. A little bit about what the caucus does, and then I'm going to introduce our panel and our fabulous panelists. All right. So the People of Color Caucus at SEWSA seeks to build visibility, solidarity, and scholarship, which centers around the experiences of people of color. So what we try to do is we say, how should we possibly and responsibly imagine ourselves articulating not only differences, but similarities in our lived experience in spaces, right? So invoking Audre Lorde, yay, we ask, how do we frame our lived experiences to be catalysts for change? And so we regularly sponsor panels at SEWSA, as well as networking receptions at each conference. And so I've been the president for probably the past year and a half of the caucus, and it has been a great pleasure. And one of probably the greatest joys has been the opportunity to talk about this book, right? Reading Black Women's Yoga History, written by Stephanie Evans. And I think that we've got a powerhouse, there you go. We've got a powerhouse panel today to kind of talk about and center our experience. I think, Black women sit in a moment where attending to like one's emotional and spiritual, physical health could not be more pressing, right? We're in the middle of a pandemic. We're in the middle of or ongoing racial upheaval and daily microaggressions, right? And at the same time, the tools to care for oneself have been co-opted by this neoliberal capitalistic juggernaut called the self-care, self-help industry, right? And because of this, right, this industry has kind of presented this forward face as a white cishet middle class woman, right? And at this moment in particular, right, we really need to be able to identify, uncover the history, the genealogy, and the legacy of self-care in BIPOC communities. And I think that Dr. Evans's book does a great job of that. And so I'm so excited to talk about it and discuss it. So this is how it's going to work. What we'll do is I will introduce all of the panelists. I will briefly read their bios, and then I will give them all the opportunity to kind of to open up and discuss their interface and their interaction, right, with the text. And then after that, we'll take some questions. I have asked each panelist to pose kind of one question at the end of their comments, and I will faithfully write those down. And then I will also open it up after Dr. Evans has had the opportunity to respond to those questions. I'll open it up to the audience. All right. So I ask all audience members who aren't on the panel to leave your cameras and your mics off. Just kind of sit back and relax and engage. And welcome. All right. So I'm just going to read the bios or share with you all about our panel in no particular order. And we will proceed in the order in which I read, okay? So first, I would like to introduce to you Rupa Singh. Dr. Rupa Bala Singh is the Assistant Professor of Law and Civic Engagement at California State University, Monterey Bay. She's a critical race theorist, legal social scientist, and licensed attorney. Rupa worked as a labor organizer and prison advocate for a decade. As a result of her public scholarship on yoga and cultural appropriation, she became the first Indian American standards advisor to the Yoga Alliance. Dr. Singh hosts the Critical Yoga Studies podcast and is the founder of this developing field. She spent a year in Kerala engaged in an ethnographic study of yoga tourism and Indian yoga teachers. She led the public panel discussion centering South Asian diasporic voices in yoga. Dr. Singh's recently published article, Yoga's Entry into American Popular Music is Racialized, is in Resonance, the Journal of Culture and the Journal of Culture and Sound. Her forthcoming article, Racial Tourism in Academia is Harmful, Legal Storytelling, Poetic Counter-Narratives and Healing, is in Genealogist Special Edition, Genealogies of Healing, Black, Indigenous, and Peoples of Color Studies. Her forthcoming book establishes a foundation for critical yoga studies through a triangulated study that proves cultural appropriation of yoga results in racialized harms. All right. I think I'm gonna reverse myself 1 second here. I want to introduce Dr. Evans next, just so that we can get a better sense of who she is. And then I'll say a little blurb. I will read a little bit about the text, and then I'll go back to introducing the panelists, right? So Dr. Evans, Dr. Stephanie Evans, is a professor of Black Women's Studies and serves as director of the the Institute for Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Georgia State University. Her interest is Black women's intellectual history, memoirs, and mental health. She's the author of 3 books: Black Women's Yoga History, Memoirs of Inner Peace, which is what we'll be discussing today, Black Passports, Travel Memoirs as a Tool for Youth Empowerment, and Black Women in the Ivory Tower, 1850 to 1954, an Intellectual History. I see that as she has said, her short bio is all right. So I'm going to finish reading what I've got here, and then we'll move forward. She's the co-editor of three books: Black Women in Social Justice Education, Black Women's Mental Health, Balancing Strength and Vulnerability, and African Americans in Community Engagement in Higher Education. She's a curator of several web resources, including the Black Women Studies Book List, Africana Memoirs Database, Black Women's Music Database, and the Black Women's Yoga History site. Right? This particular text, Black Women's Yoga History, Memoirs of Inner Peace, examines how Black women elders have managed stress, emphasizing how self-care practices have been present since at least the mid-19th century, with roots in African traditions, right? So this is the context and the basis. So I've introduced the text and Dr. Evans, and I'm gonna return to introducing our panelists. All right, I've got Rumia Pucha. Pucha is an assistant professor of Hugh Hodgkins School of Music and the Institute of Women's Studies. Her research interests center on post-Enlightenment, colonial, and post-colonial thought, particularly around constructs of race, citizenship, gender, sexuality, the body, and the law. Professor Pucha received her PhD from the University of Chicago in 2011, and her first book, Mythical Courtesan, Modern Wife, Feminist Praxis in Transnational South Asia, develops a decolonial feminist approach to South Asian performance cultures. She's currently working on a project titled Refrains of a Hillbilly Elegy, Country Boys, Social Media, and the Effective Politics of 21st Century White Supremacy, which examines expressions of race, citizenship, and post-9/11 American cultural politics within music publics. Her second book, entitled Namaste Nation, Commercial Yoga Industries and U.S. Imperialism, extends her work on South Asian performance cultures to critical analysis of capitalist yoga practices within legal, effective discourses of body, race, wellness, and citizenship. Her blog, Namaste Nation, Orientalism and Yoga in the 21st Century, can be found online. Next, I'd like to introduce Layla Maparian. Layla Maparian, PhD, is the Catherine Stone Kaufman 67 Executive Director of Wellesley Centers for Women and Professor and Chair of Africana Studies at Wellesley College. She's published 2 groundbreaking books in the field of womanist studies, namely The Womanist Reader and The Womanist Idea, with a 3rd book, Womanism Rising, forthcoming. She's a current Fulbright Specialist and has served previously as Fulbright Specialist at the University of Liberia, with other international projects in West Africa and India. Previously, she held the Contemplative Practice Fellowship for the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society, which supported travel to Plum Village in France and the development of a signature course, Womanist Perspectives on Spiritual Activism. She sits on the board of directors at the Global Fund for Women and is an active member of the Baha'i Faith. Dr. Maparian's full profile is available online as well. Dr. Roxanne Donovan is professor of psychology and interdisciplinary studies at Kennesaw State University and is a licensed psychologist in Georgia. She's been teaching, researching, training, and practicing in the areas of health and wellness for 20 years. She uses methods of behavioral change that empower clients to identify and achieve their goals in ways that align with personal values. All right? As a Black feminist, cis woman of multiracial descent, Black, Asian, and white, Dr. Donovan is committed to using her expertise to develop programs and scholarship that help women of color combat the systemic, interpersonal, individual stressors that hurt health and impede growth. All right. And finally, I've got Jenna Long. I'm sorry, I have one more. I've got Carla Scott after Jenna Long. Jenna Long is the executive director of the Black Yoga Teachers Alliance and Power One Yoga, LLC, based in Baltimore. She's a yoga therapist. I can never say this word right. A Ayurvedic lifestyle consultant, meditation facilitator, and mentor who specializes in the therapeutic application of yoga to inspire and empower people 60 years and older to revitalize their bodies and spirits, with practices focused on full spectrum of aging and wellness. Jenna has traveled globally to West and North Africa, India, Central America, across the US to study meditation and contemplative practice with a diverse yoga and spiritual community. And last but not least, I have Dr. Carla Scott, who's a professor of communications at St. Louis University. Her teaching and research focus on Black women's lived experiences across communicative contexts and the dialogue strategies across identity differences and racial divisions. Dr. Scott is the author of A Language of Strong Black Womanhood, Myths, Models, Messages, and a New Mandate for Self-Care. She is the recipient of the Organization for the Study of Communication, Language, and Gender Outstanding Journal Article Award for Communication Strategies Across Cultural Borders, Dispelling Stereotypes, Performing Competence, and Redefining Black Womanhood, which was published in Women's Studies Communication, as well as an outstanding recipient of the Outstanding Journal Article Award from the National Communication Association of American Communication and Culture Division for her article, Young, Shifting, and Black, Leaving the Language of Home and Back Again, a cautionary tale of crossing race and gender, which is published in Qualitative Inquiry. In case you can't tell, we are full up in here, all right? We have a powerhouse panel, so I'm going to open it up, and in no particular order, I'm just gonna go ahead and start with Dr. Rupa Singh.
Well, I didn't know about the short bio option, so now I know that for future conferences. I'm very honored to be here and to meet all of you and to connect with those folks listening. So first we do first impressions, and then we do a question. So I will do my best to remain disciplined. First, I'll say the first impression, this book was sent with a lot of love. And the love continues as you delve into the book, and it doesn't stop until you end. And matters of love can initially seem to be potentially shallow, just like the wellness industry can seem, shallow to talk about, easy to talk about love. And yet we know from other Black womanist authors and from a very rich conversation on love in general, including bell hooks and others, that love is a serious matter. And so that was a first impression, is that this is a book that will help you to breathe. And that shows a lot of love. Another first impression I got was from this chapter, the first full chapter, Yoga is Self-Possession. And what I appreciate most about this chapter broadly is that it offers an excellent survey, sort of where we are in that line of Black women's yoga history. And so the survey offered here really speaks to the oft-stated goal of fueling future research and having this text be a resource that is rich for future questions and archival exploration. And so I would turn people's attention to Yoga as Self-Possession to get a sense of where we are at with Black in Om, Black in yoga, Black in Namaste, all of these sort of evolving and popular, necessary platforms, where we are at with them, where did they begin in terms of US history, and where are they heading? There are some archives mentioned that excited me. For example, at Emory, there just seems to be all of this archival richness just waiting for us to till the land. Again, like love, all forms of love is not for the faint of heart. There's a lot of digging up of perhaps life's where breath was more challenged, or just a lot of digging up of lives. And so I take heart in the inspiration here. I think one of the other points that I wanted to make, building on that excellent survey, is that there's one of the stated goals in the conclusion has to do with, it's on page 361, where Dr. Evans says, Stephanie says, Africana yoga, she offers a definition for Africana yoga, offers a platform for Africana yoga, says this is a ripe field for appreciating principles of Indian yoga, even while fueling the breath practices of Black people in liberation struggles, Black people across the board. And I think that idea right there sets Stephanie's book apart. And I think that there is room to grapple with that conclusory hope vis-a-vis chapter 1 in the survey. So there's room even within the book to continue to build the connections that are identified. And since we are all at initial stages of sort of laying claim to a space that has been rapidly commodified and privatized, we are all at these kind of initial stages of naming, characterizing, defining, and that's something that's exciting about the book. And so yeah, that last piece, that Africana yoga is a right field for appreciating principles of Indian yoga. I think that's there's so much courage in that, and it can be brought to all parts of the book, rigorously. I think the question. So I'm at 5 minutes. So I want to go to my question. There's this part where you talk about. So a dear friend of mine, a male friend, recently told me about Cicely Tyson's role in Miles Davis's life. And there's a part where Stephanie writes how strategic silence can be as powerful as using one's own voice. So there's this a jazz element. Same, there's all this connection between jazz and classical Indian music in terms of the expertise that leads to improvisation. That's a difficult word, improvisation. But I think my question for you is, in all the books, and this book in particular, where did you feel like you were strategically silent? Where was that strategic silence for you? Where did you notice it coming up for you? Because I wonder about the power in that strategic silence.
Thank you, Dr. Stone. Next, we'll go to Dr. Donovan.
I really don't want to follow that, but I will try. I was really excited to get this book in the mail for several reasons. One of them being that I just received my yoga teacher training certification. And there is this way that working in wellness, whether it's on the psychology side, I'm a psychologist, in thinking about emotions and in thinking about thinking, and wellness on the body and spirit side, which also influences emotions and thinking, that I often feel like I'm an interloper in a space that isn't created, isn't welcoming for me or people like me. And I do the work because I think it is desperately needed in our communities to have spaces of healing. And so I have this sense of ambivalence when I'm in these spaces, when I look around and I'm one of the only or one of a few. And so, Dr. Evans, your book, I've written it, I've proselytized on it because it gave me life. It created a bridge from my space of ambivalence and my sense of erasure and non-belonging. And not only me, I speak of me, but I mean we. A bridge to a possibility of a history that you could say was decentered, you could say was marginalized, you could say it was erased, that I really needed to find comfort, full comfort in the practice. And so my first impression, I mean, you said this, Rupa, it's like coming home. It's like you created home for me in these practices that I've done at home. But when I do in the public sphere, I can't quite find comfort space because I'm scanning for threat, because of the packaging and the dominant culture of what it means to practice yoga, what it means to practice mindfulness and meditation, what it means to practice wellness has been co-opted and conscripted to be a space solely for thin, abled, wealthy white women. So I hope I hope I'm being clear about what this means to me, because it's hard to put into words when I read about Rosa Parks. I had to get on the phone with my girlfriends and say, did you know Rosa Parks practiced? Did you read the book? Because that is our history in there, that in the yoga teacher training, in the mindfulness-based stress reduction, because we have had very similar journeys, Dr. Evans. I have done the things. And so when I was reading, I'm like, you've done the things, like these spaces, you've got to search to find spaces in which you don't feel othered. And so when I read the history, when I read your beautiful, beautiful telling of the history, I saw us there in a way that I couldn't have imagined previously. And so my deepest gratitude for writing the book, for sharing the book, for sharing our history and our legacy, and for helping me find home. And I will extend the ripples of your empowerment outward. I promise I will proselytize going forward. And so my question is about the public-private sphere in this work. There is such power when you share the practice in community, when you feel safe in that community, right? So I want to know, do you have or have you experienced ambivalence moving from the private space, from your home, private sphere, to practicing in the public sphere, because of how wellness practices are conceptualized, are lived in the dominant culture? And if the answer is no, you've reconciled that ambivalence. I need some secrets. I need to know how you did it. I need ingredients to further help with my ambivalence when I work in the public sphere to practice what I think is deeply, deeply important. Because at the end of the day, what your book reminded me of is that wellness should not be owned by a particular culture. Like we need it. Gendered racism, racialized sexism, the violence, the harassment, like we need healing. And what does it mean to have the practice not represent us when it is so needed? So thank you again with deep gratitude.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Duncan. Jana.
I made it.
Well, I'm going to ask you to go. I'm going to ask you to go next.
You're going to ask me to go next?
No, maybe not.
I just got here. And I'm on two different computers. I'm looking at one. Oh my God, it's a mess.
I wanted to
ask
you.
Technological nightmare. Let me look.
I got you. I just wanted to ask you before we lost you again, but you sort that out. And I'm
doing my best. Let me see. I need to.
Who, of course, just took a step to go ahead and go next.
Oops. Okay. I'm getting feedback.
Turn off one of your devices. You'll have to turn the sound off.
Okay. Let's do this.
Let's see now. Okay. I think you asked me to go next. Yes?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Thank you. I am going to set my time because very honestly, I am so excited and have so much to say. I could not contain it. I also have notes because, again, I have so much to say that there was no way I'd stay focused. So I am going to hit start and begin by thanking Dr. Evans for this book, first of all, and for the opportunity to participate in this panel today. It's such an honor to be here and in the company of such outstanding sister scholars, as I like to say, and yogis. And I really appreciate the time offered to share my initial impressions, or as I like to say, the reasons I fanned out when I read this book. And I begin by admitting that happened because I am a Black feminist, womanist scholar who advocates knowledge creation that centers Black women. And as a social scientist, my heart always skips a beat and eagerly engages with research that examines and reveals the unknown in our everyday lived experiences. And when that knowledge is produced about us, for us, and by us, well, I consider that a trifecta and get really fanned out. And what a contribution this book made to Black women. Got reverb. A body of literature that has guided several generations of Black feminist, womanist scholars looking for mentors and methods that validate and affirm intellectual curiosities needed to answer questions that center us. After 3 decades of doing my own work, I know the struggle remains real for us, but I believe the path grows clearer. And with this book's focus on self-care as restoration for inner peace and survival, we now have much needed modeling of how we can support ourselves as we continue to lift as we climb in the name of recovering Black history and changing the narrative of Black womanhood. So my impressions, my first is profound appreciation for the use of archival work, memoir, and autoethnography. This offers a compelling triangulation of Black women's voices that really does push back and resist those representations of Black women with some mythical strength for survival. In this work, we find Black women survivors articulating intention and attention to restorative self-care to support their strength and survival. This is Black feminist, womanist scholarship needed right now to counter these tropes honoring the strong Black woman with no space in between those 3 words, right? The strong Black woman without acknowledging the detriment of embracing that mandate. As it uncovers the intellectual history of yoga as a form of restorative self-care for notable Black women, it offers insight into their survival as they navigated a life filled with physical, emotional, spiritual violence and attacks from both individuals and society in systems that are race, gendered, and class oppression. This model of self-care and restoration for strength has been missing. My second moment to fan out is the accessibility of this book. It is scholarly in its presentation of information for academic reading, and at the same time accessible for a more lay audience who will be excited to learn more about the lives of these iconic Black women elders and activists in their own voices, and their use of yoga as self-care to survive, sustain, and support well-being, and the critical work they did. Making the academic accessible can be valuable in Black women's studies, and I think especially in undergraduate courses, where the concept of Black women's self-care explored in this book is introduced in ways that can cultivate students' ongoing intellectual
Why can't
curiosity
I see this?
about Black women's survival.
Oh, this is a pain.
And the mandate for strength. Encountering the real lived experiences of iconic Black women through their own voices and stories is an opportunity to see another version and vision of Black womanhood, and can encourage and motivate a desire to know more about not just the women, but how a specific strategy for self-care supported survival as a Black woman. And that strategy, of course, is yoga. In many Black communities, an accessible academic account of the history of Black women's individual and collective trauma and yoga memoirs can demystify the practice, revealing how yoga is more than just a physical practice for certain bodies and certain bank accounts, can create curiosity leading to opportunities to learn more about the possibilities for health, happiness, and well-being in our own bodies, lives, and communities. So my question, how might you envision this book, your work, your words, as a centering of Black women's health and wellness that's critical for sister scholars across generations in the Embodiment Academy? Recently, a young sister scholar shared with me, she's in her second tenure track position, and she said, quote, "I feel like at every point of my journey, they have taken a chunk out of me." End quote. Restoration needs to be normalized in the same way mythical Black women's strength continues to be. So in closing, I ask, how might your work support Black feminist womanist scholars to normalize self-care for restoration and survival as we do the rigorous work of liberation, social justice education, and political transformation? Thank you. And thank you for this book. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Scott. Next, I'd like to ask Runya Pucha, Dr. Runya Pucha. Thank you.
Hi. So thank you so much to Stephanie, to SEWSA, and to Dr. Frances Henderson, and of course to all of you for a chance to be part of this important conversation. My name again is Ramya Pucha, and it has been an honor to be in dialogue with Dr. Evans and her work over the past year. And what an experience it was to sit with this book over these last few months. I am a feminist performance studies scholar by way of music, so my contribution to this panel is shaped by an acute awareness that discourses of body and voice and of history and subjectivity often operate in distinct spaces. With this observation in mind, I'd like to offer a few thoughts today that will hopefully be useful for our discussion. I was wondering about the work embodiment does for a conceptualization of yoga. Though the term itself is not explicitly theorized in the book, the notion of an interior life as distinct from an exterior or public one is prominent throughout this work. The practice of good health, as I understood it, suggests a process of translation and anchoring between the private and public for Black women. a way to cultivate a sense of self that can sustain one in public life. Arguably, the idea that the human experience can be categorized as that which can be embodied or alternatively disembodied reveals a residue of the racial sciences in which it first found purchase. This logic, as many feminist scholars like Maria Lugones have noted by now, reinscribes an enduring coloniality of race and gender. So in thinking about embodiment, I was particularly curious about what differentiates certain bodily movement practices from one another. For example, is there a universalist discourse that makes any bodily practice, especially those that lend themselves to wellness or that involve breathing or stretching, yoga, whether or not it's termed as such? And if so, do yoga and dance share a somatic genealogy that makes them related somehow? So to extend this line of questioning to processes of gender and racialization, I was left wondering how we might understand Eartha Kitt's memoirs on yoga, though not called yoga, within a broader historical context. Indeed, at the same moment that Eartha Kitt was performing complex yoga poses as part of her own promotional materials, African-American musicians like John Redd were adopting Orientalist imagery to perform on television. John Redd became famous by his stage name, Kola Pandit, and his trajectory shares some fascinating similarities with Kitt's, particularly the way Black and white photography shaped public perceptions of their race, gender, and sexuality. American studies scholars like Manan Desai have examined careers like Redd's in the context of the Cold War, which might in part explain why the term yoga remains referential to geographic understandings of the Orient, in this case, India. In this regard, I was wondering if we could think more about the way language like yoga, or also jazz, as you noted in another case, betrays certain indexical properties. To recall the comparison on pages 198 and 199, what did it mean for Miles Davis to resist others calling his music jazz? Is this the same process when some of the elders you cite resist calling their practice by a certain name? If not, what does the adaptation or rejection of certain rhetoric, in this case yoga, reveal about the experience or embodiment of wellness? In following these discursive threads, I was also intrigued by the connections you draw to the bodily activities that are understood as exercise. In particular, I wondered if there were more synergies between various genres of bodily practice. To contextualize, I have noticed, somewhat anecdotally, how the academic study of the body is often framed by disciplinary imperatives that render the body invisible. For example, yoga scholarship in the Anglo-American Academy is often housed in religious studies departments, while dance studies is often, though not always, housed in exercise science, or in some cases, the humanities or social sciences, in departments like anthropology, or in my case, music. This propensity to mask the body is certainly how racial logics endure under capitalism, but it is also something scholars like Karen Sanchez Epler have suggested is a lasting legacy of the Three-Fifths Compromise. Put another way, if the body serves as an emblem of citizenship, then it also becomes a problem for those who are not male or white. I found myself wondering if part of a history of yoga in the US, and Black women's yoga in particular, could be examined in this vein. So in closing my question, I want to ask Dr. Evans if she could perhaps speculate on how a genealogical history of yoga might have shaped her inquiry. For example, how might locating yoga within a longer and often fraught relationship between India and the US have changed your approach? Thank you again for having me here today, Stephanie.
Thank you, Dr. Pilcher. Dr. Lele Maparia.
Thank you, Dr. Henderson, and thank you to everyone else here. I feel like I'm in incredibly eminent and enriching company, and It's wonderful to circle around Stephanie and sing the praises of her latest book in the long stream of her written works. When I was asked to think about my first impressions of the book, the very first sentence that came into my mind is that this book is healing medicine and that you could actually write a prescription for this book. To read it generates healing energy. In fact, I found myself, as I began reading it myself, just literally sinking into a sense of calm. My own stresses, were just unwinding, but it's because of the way she wrote it. But it really drove home the point that bibliotherapy is real. And as she talks about it, scriptotherapy is also real. And they remind us why we need to write the books that we want and need to read. It reminds us that nobody can do this work but us. And that even though it takes courage in academia to step outside many of the norms and canons of Western academic writing and scholarship, to do so in the way that Professor Evans has fashioned this book is not outside the realm of the normative traditions of erudition and wisdom, particularly in Africana cultures. And so there are these threads, there's the thread of intellect and there's the thread of wisdom. Sometimes they overlap and sometimes they don't. But this book is definitely consistent with the thread of wisdom at the same time as it meets the standards of the thread of intellectualism. But the way in Africana, particularly Africana women's communities, that we graze knowledge, information, and experience and combine it is different from the normative kind of Western linear model of narrative, of deductive understanding or inductive understanding. It's just a different way of processing information and presenting it to people. Another thing that's really important and stands out in terms of my first impressions is the ability to speak to the folk. This is important, and to do so in a way that brings people of diverse literacies into a common conversation. Sometimes in the world of academia, we forget the diversity of literacies that exist in the world. And it is a gift and an art form to be able to bring such people together under the umbrella of wisdom and sharing of that knowledge. So this book does all of those things. Now, my second main impression has to do with spirituality, and in particular, writing about spirituality as though it is real. It's not only an expression of Africana worldview, but it is also a necessity of these times. From my perspective, humanity is dying for lack of recognition of human beings' dual nature as simultaneously material and spiritual beings who live in two worlds, one of them visible, the other invisible, all at once. Womanists are working hard to help humanity realize what we've always known, that we're spiritual beings, that there is a spiritual realm, that there is a divine presence from whom we draw energy and life, and that there is an optimal way to walk this path. And I think that this book brings those recognitions to the fore, invites us not only to consider them, but to experience them. This book acknowledges the spiritual thread without apology and offers multiple points of access to the domain of the spiritual, from yoga to memoir, biography, and life writing, to natural healing, meditation, and so many more modalities. At the center of it all is the restoration of wellness and the recognition that our dis-ease, our very acute current dis-ease, as well as our very chronic and intergenerational dis-ease, is multiply caused by multiple spiritual, material, social, political, economic, cultural, psychic, and environmental imbalances and traumas. It starts the turning of the healing wheel just by speaking the truth of all of these things, which we so often gloss over. So that's really my review. And I just want to end with a commentary about Professor Evans as who she is. The word that came to me is that she is a priestess whose medium is academic writing and academic magic. And she is in the lineage of other academic priestesses she has written about, such as Mary McLeod Bethune, Anna Julia Cooper, Fanny Jackson Coppin, Septima Poinsett Clark, and so many others. My question to Stephanie is, what would you like to see done with this book? And now that it's in the world, what do you hope happens? Because so rarely do people give us as Black women carte blanche to explain our vision, say what we want to have happen, and set that in motion. So that's what I want to hear from you, Stephanie. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Maparian. Jana Long. All right. Looks like we got all together. I turn the floor over to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm so glad I got everything working, and it is really a pleasure to be here with you and listening and hearing and contemplating and reflecting on all that's been said this afternoon. So, of course, my approach to this, I am the practitioner, the teacher of yoga. I've had a long yoga practice. I first was introduced or became aware of yoga in 1972. And I was about 19, going on 20 years old at the time. And it came to me through a study of astrology. It just sort of, my mind, my spirit led me in that direction. And I was seeking. I was a spiritual seeker. I don't have a sad story as a woman. I was raised well. I've never been abused, and I was taught not to center myself in whiteness. And it's from that direction or from that point of view that I have evolved in my practice of yoga. What I particularly enjoyed about the book, and I have to confess, I haven't finished reading it yet. I'm still making my way through, but I'm about halfway there. I enjoyed all the literary references, and I'll say this is why. This thing that we're called yoga, and especially among Black people, is very much a 21st century phenomenon. In 1972, let's put it this way, I was 30 years with awareness of yoga, a practice of yoga, and I'll speak of that 30 years before I encountered another Black person who was practicing yoga. So this growth, this acceptance, because there's a lot of resistance to yoga and among Black people as late as the late 1990s. We thought very often that it was an attempt to change your religion or to convert you to Hinduism. And a new understanding has emerged. But we move into a yoga practice, knowledge of yoga, the definition of it becomes narrow. And this is where Stephanie's book comes in. The references in the book, this word yoga wasn't part of our lexicon in 1972. We weren't talking about yoga. And it didn't matter what your race was. Hardly anybody was talking about yoga. And those people who weren't letting other people know, because you could be labeled a weirdo and ostracized as if people thought it was a cult type thing. So what you learned was more on the contemplative. There was not the focus on the body or as this healing. It was the reflection. You came into yoga seeking answers, very simple, to the very fundamental question that we all ask ourselves when we're young, especially: who am I? Who am I? And why am I here? And I would say that is what led people into a practice of yoga. I would like to offer what the definition of yoga is, as codified by Patanjali in the system of Ashtanga Yoga. The second sutra that defines yoga in the language of Sanskrit, and I do speak Sanskrit with somewhat of an American accent, so please forgive me. Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Yogas is stilling the flow of the mind. Yoga is a contemplative practice. Yoga is a practice for living. It is we do the physical practice so that we can be comfortable with ourselves, so that we can still our minds to see our own reflection. If your mind is constantly working, it makes it very difficult for you to see yourself and project outward and judge outward as opposed to bringing that back in. So that's how I learned yoga, and why I say it has become more narrowly defined, almost to relegated to physical fitness now. What we learned, it encompassed everything. So we read literature, we went to plays. These were ways of broadening your mind, not necessarily your body, because yoga is eternal, infinite, and whole. You will leave the body. The body changes every day. And I can testify to someone who did many things with my body when I was 19, 20, even up to 50, that have changed. Bodies change, but that indwelling spirit, that who am I, that has been shaped by the context of your life, your literature, your history, your community, your family. I think what is missing, and I believe with Stephanie showing the historical context, not so much what was called yoga, but what was done as part of self-care, part of keeping your head on straight in times of extreme challenges. Um, One of the things is the parts of the book that I read, and I'll wind up, but something really came to mind as a practice. And maybe some of you are familiar, you have some understanding. When I was a little girl with my grandmother, we were in Georgia, and it seemed that every day there was a major thunderstorm, like about 3, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The sky would darken, the clouds would come, it would rain furiously, thunder and lightning. When that storm was coming, the kids, all of us, my cousins and neighbors' kids, if we come in the house, she would make us sit quietly until that storm blew over. You sat still, and the house would get dark because these were like, big thunderstorms. But in that time, no talking. You certainly weren't playing any games. She turned off all the lights, right? And I remember those moments of being quiet, being in that still, being in the dark, not talking, not laughing. You can even laugh. Just being there was the beginning of contemplative practice. And to this day, I even with my own grandchildren have a time with them every week. And it's a yoga practice. I let them move around, but every time it ends with, can you sit still like a statue for whatever
And I
duration
think
of
that's
time?
Exactly. And I think that's a beautiful place to kind of pause and being in that silent contemplative place. And thank you for that, Jana. Dr. Evans, I'm going to turn it over to you. We have had some brilliant analysis and feedback, and I want to give you the rest of the time to kind of respond to the questions that our panelists have asked.
Wow. Thank you, everyone, so much for being here. Thank you, SEWSA, and thank you to the respondents. And I know, I saw a lot of comments in preparing for this that reflected the known fact that if you have more than 3 people on a panel, it's going to be a disaster. Everyone leaves dissatisfied because they didn't get enough time to talk. But in this case, I just knew that bringing this group together would be different, because all of you are master storytellers. But more than that, this work is about the art of listening. And on panels, specifically academic panels, everybody wants to talk and talking over each other and going over time, and not when it says 5 minutes, though, well, what I have to say is so very important. And so I'm not going to stick to 5. Everybody stuck to 5 minutes. This is ridiculous. But it's not surprising to me that this is a different kind of panel. It's a different kind of space, because this is a different kind of conversation. And each of you brought something so special to this discussion that it was exactly what I had really hoped this would be, which was a listening party. Album drops, you get together and you all just listen, and it's possible to be in the same room, not talk over each other, vibe with each other, and really get to know, oh, shoot, I didn't see in that track that this was happening. Oh, okay, well, I hadn't even gotten to that. Okay. And so the listening party was really all I wanted. And I'm so grateful for this opportunity to go through what this book means, because, and thinking about a concept of like the personal is political. So I'm teaching feminist theories this semester, and personal is political is one of those cornerstone understandings of what it means to teach feminist ideas. And the fact that in the 1970s that several women were credited and then rejected credit for the idea of the personal political, it doesn't belong to anyone. It is a collective construction of meaning. And so this is what this is for me. And Beverly Guy Sheftall and Janetta Cole in Gender Talk started with this idea that the personal is political. So that in women's communities, in Black women's communities in particular, that meaning is constructed in community, and that the personal connection, this book is not what I say it is. This book is what y'all say it is, or we all usin say that this book is. And so this the meaning making process of this book is in my mind now beginning to be complete, because I wrote the damn thing. I don't know what it says. I'm like, oh, is that what I said? Oh, I'm a priestess. I'm gonna put academic priestess, Laylee, I'm gonna put academic priestess on my byline right now. But I'm so excited to really pick up on Regina Bradley and Aisha Durham in the SEWSA lunch plenary today. We're talking about so many of the themes of, coming home to ourselves and having these very real talk conversations. And so I see that this is a continuation, and this is a particular space to do so. So I'll go through very quickly and address address the questions as they were posed in my furious notes. Thank you, Rupa Singh, for identifying that this is done with love, which very much reflected Carla Scott's first assessment as well, that I love this book. I love this work. and I love myself, this is a process of learning to love myself, in that I remember looking in the mirror. A friend of mine said, Jill, her name was Jill. She always used to say, I love myself. Oh, I love myself. And I was like, you were so conceited. That is terrible. What is wrong with you? And she says, you don't love yourself? And I was like, that's just the stupidest quote. I've never even heard that. And she said, you don't love yourself. And she made me look in the mirror and she says, say you love yourself. And I couldn't. And I burst into tears and started crying, because I was like, this is dumb. This is stupid. Oh my God. And so this is done with care and love for me, because even though, as Janice pointed out, not everyone has a story of personal trauma, we are all taught not to love ourselves, as Black women in particular. I appreciate the picking up on the room to rebuild, that there's room to build connections. And it was imperative to me, and I'm grateful to Rupa and Ramya for entertaining conversations with me, because if I'm going to demand that people #cite Black women and #cite SEWSA, if I'm writing about yoga, I need to #cite Indian and South Asian women scholars of yoga, not simply because they are Asian friends, but because they are scholars of yoga. And so I'm grateful for the insights that helped me pull together this book. So Rupa's question, what strategic silences did I entertain? And she referenced Cicely Tyson, who, when I put this book together, had not written her memoir. And so the memoir just came out, called Just As I Am. And she actually talks about chanting, right? She writes about chanting Nam Myo Renge Kyo, and having that not be in conflict with her Christianity. And so as a long living Black woman, as someone who understood that she didn't have to say everything to everything, and this, she dropped her book and then she's like, peace out. Mama Tyson just said, y'all work it out. Y'all discuss this. Literally a couple of days after she passed, after her book dropped, she passed. And that is the ultimate, she was exercising her voice when and how and where she wanted to. And that is, that's a mastery of strategic silence. What was I silent about? I did not and do not generally give the details of my abuse in public, or unless I'm in a community with survivors, because there then is often this, and then what happened? Oh, that's terrible. And then what happened? And I do reveal the details of my abuse when I feel it is appropriate, but I believe that therapy is therapy, and presentation spaces are not always therapy, although it is. Kanika Bell says that every time I mention being a survivor, I give someone the power to find their own voice as well. So I do sometimes I reveal a little bit more, but my are often strategic, and sometimes it's just for my own protection. It's not even that I am willfully strategic. It's that I know that I can't tell everybody everything all the damn time. Roxanne Donovan, thank you so much for identifying that I have created home. In fact, my practice is generally a home practice. So when I decided that I'd been doing yoga for quite some time informally, and I wanted to know more about it, so I did get my yoga certification. I've taught exactly 2 classes, and realized then that I was not the best yoga teacher. Not that I could not improve with time, but I felt exhausted in that I've been department chair for 11 years. I'm teaching, I'm leading, I'm doing all these things. And so when I was teaching, even though I was very much invested in that practice, it became clear almost immediately that that was not my gift. and that my practice would, my contribution to teach would be to teach about that, but to maintain my private practice. And the idea of scanning for threat, in that I've generally had good experiences the few times that I have taken classes, but I've been kind of strategic about which classes I attend, and having certain encounters with instructors that I knew or knew I would enjoy. And so now the interesting thing is that with COVID, that has created a requirement to go online. And so there's this kind of management of personal and public and private space in a very different way. So I basically give grace to myself to not do yoga in public and not feel like I'm cheating anyone. And I love, but I follow Rupa on IG, and this is why I was doing this, the breathing. There is a way to do that practice in public that is sharing and instructive, that is not necessarily what we think we know yoga to be. And so I'm grateful for that private space, but also honor those who do that in the public space as well. Carla Scott, thank you so much for recognizing that my work is a blend, right? Blended methodology, blended methods, interdisciplinary, and strategy for version and vision, that I strive to be accessible. This was really a follow-up to Black Women in the Ivory Tower, which was a book about Black women academics, very much written in academic language, and that I wanted this to not sacrifice my academic language, but to be able to translate in a way that was accessible to the public. But my primary audience is, that I'm very clear, my primary audience is Black women. And that if Black women, not one or two, but if Black women generally as a group, because there will always be one or two detractors that people like to point to say your work isn't good. Well, you know, this particular person didn't like it, that's fine. But if as a group, generally, the Black women's opinions that are voiced find it accessible and say this is quality work, then I'm good with that. And that I love that it's not just about certain bodies and certain bank accounts. So the question was about restoration and normalizing self-care. And I think this is why I was very much attracted to Roxanne Donovan's work about academic wellness. We live in a violent world. We live in a violent nation. We live in a violent profession. We live in a violent state, violent institutions, violent units. And academic wellness and the idea that it's okay to refuse to, as much as possible, let people take a chunk out of you every day. That is resistance. And that resistance I've gotten really strong about, because I'm doing it in community. There's Kanika Bell and Nasinga Burton, who were the co-editors. I mean, I'm mindful of time too, so I'm going to speed it up because I know we want to give time for other questions. Kanika Bell and Nasinga Burton, co-editors of Black Women's Mental Health. We had our writing party, our editing party at a spa back in the days when outside was open, right? And so we're trying to create a different model of writing. And, you know, we went up to Chateau Elan and we're like, let's have a little champagne brunch, and then we're going to edit this chapter, and then we're going to go get a massage, and we're going to finish editing the chapter. And that was a way, you know, we had a champagne brunch for a collective writing for those who could make it, so that we're writing in community and not normalizing stress, that we're normalizing and modeling a collective practice. Ramya Pucha, thank you so much for your question about embodiment and dance. And, we've talked about this very much like Arupa's connection to music and jazz, pointing that out, that we have a connection through dance, that I did come to yoga practice through dance, and that there's such an overlap that, as was pointed out, this is really just a survey. This is a reference book from which we can unpack all of these things. This was me just trying to put everything in one place so we know the parameters of the discussion and that we can take in any direction that we like. And so definitely pointing out Miles Davis's use of, he's in his voice, I call it social music. I don't do jazz. And so if you're looking at people like Catherine Dunham, right, who is Eartha Kitt's teacher, who does not mention yoga, but she created a whole physical body practice that we know as the Dunham dance program, right? She created a model that was very much interdisciplinary, pulled from ballet, pulled from modern, but also pulled from her research in, and this is where we get into mapping the geographies of what we call dance and movement, because she did go to the Caribbean, she did go to the African continent, and she was one of many, like Zora Neale Hurston, who was also an anthropologist, who are pulling these strands together. And I didn't go into it, but when you asked about the, how would I envision this in relation to like genealogies in India and the US, the Black body, Radhika Monharam, talked about being Indian in New Zealand, being India in India, and being Indian in the United States, and how her Blackness was seen and translated differently. So I think there's a lot more room to talk about Indian Blackness or Aboriginal Blackness in terms of Australia. And this was just kind of an opening of a conversation about what we're defining as diaspora and Blackness. And so I think there's a lot more room to move around there in that question about mapping bodies. Healing medicine, Layli Maparian. Listen, I'm ruling by light, the Loxocracy, right? The womanist idea of ruling by light, like Lenny Kravitz said, let love rule. We gonna let it rule. We gonna let it shine. And I'm so indebted to your work, as you know, like defining self-care and the relationship between, I'm so glad you guys are on the same screen. It's fantastic. Layli Maparian and Jana Long both defined self-care as health, healing, and wellness. So I didn't have to be like extra creative and come up with, I am going to create a definition of self-care that just no one has ever thought of. And, how we love to act like we doing something in academia, right? I was like, listen, these two Black women from very different places and very different experiences, self-care is this, health, healing, wellness. That's my methodological framework. That's how I'm going to define this. And it was very helpful to see those things together. Question, what would I like to see done? This is it. I'm following, and this is very much a public health model. This is very much a Billy Avery Center for Black Women's Wellness, Black Women's, I'm unoriginal. Like, let's just be very clear. I don't like making stuff up. I add my own sauce to it, but the reason why I'm quote unquote successful in academia and why this work is doing what I want it to do is because I'm just trying to be as mindful as the ancestors and the elders have done. And so I want to do consciousness raising. I want this to be collective healing. I want to amplify the voices like Jan Willis, right? Like the Mute R. Kelly activists, like the hashtag, Me Too, and people who have not heard that Rosa Parks had done yoga, right? Which Rupa said, there was many people who saw that picture before I did. And Rupa said, I didn't publish it because I didn't want to exploit it, right? And so I want us to, approaching what kind of Jana Long was talking about, I want us to understand that while this is not popular or popular in waves, and that we thought we were the only one, right? You didn't find another Black person doing yoga for 30 years, that I want to demystify this history and say it's here. Point to places in the archives like Howard University as a hotbed of yoga. If you look in the archives, who knew? And things that we've been presented with before, like Ebony Magazine, kind of dig into the footnotes and those deeper discussions that have been going on. So, short answer is I want to connect and I want to amplify. I want to connect to you all and have that ripple out and then amplify these voices. And lastly, Jana Long, thank you so much for offering your experience and grace and reading the first, doing a close read of the chapters, just to make sure that I'm, not out here with my slip showing. I appreciate, that's, and to be able to amplify the multiple communities. Black Yoga Teachers Alliance is a central community, but there's so many different gatherings of folks to make us visible to each other, to make us recognizable to each other. And so as much as I challenge like institutions, I do think that doing the work of leadership of any, whether it's an academic unit or an organization, is just so challenging. And I appreciate what you've tried to do to bring folks together. And so I think I'll end again just by saying thank you to everyone, and we can open it up for additional questions. Thank you, Stacy Keltner and SEWSA. I see Lynn Corbell's on the line too, MBSR, Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction, and CBCT. I've taken a lot of different classes, and I'm committed to learning and committing to practice. As Maya Angelou said when she met someone who says, I'm a Christian, she says, already? So this is about the practice. I want to be well, and I'm learning to do that in practice. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Evans. That was awesome. Thank you to the entire panel. At this point, I want to do two things. I want to open up to questions from the broader audience. I'm going to ask that you drop your questions into the chat if you have them. We can go a little bit longer, probably about 15, 20 minutes. But I also want to bring to your attention that Dominique Carmen, that we've got a yoga session coming up after this panel, and that will be led by Dominique Carmen. And if you want to go to that yoga session, I highly encourage everyone to do that. You just pop into our sessions tab over here, and it should appear in about 10 minutes. So, and
can I make one PSA? I'm so sorry to interrupt. I just realized that there will be a larger discussion, and I'll be working with SEWSA for a larger discussion in June, and the book will be in paperback in June as well. So sorry about that.
That's
but
okay.
Thank you so much.
That's okay. No, I was gonna ask you to talk a little bit more about that actually in the Q&A, but thank you for mentioning that. And that will be in June. And Dr. Evans has partnered with SEWSA again, and we'll have a broader discussion. I believe we're going to have some yoga there and a bunch of different meditative practices, and so that's going to be really exciting. This is kind of our springboard into this broader discussion. But so yes, so if you've got any questions, please drop them in the chat. I wanted also to remind you about the yoga session that we have planned for to start at 6:30. So go change your clothes and come back for the yoga session. But we will stick around here for probably about 10 or 15 minutes more to ask and answer any more questions. And I actually have one, Dr. Evans. I love the text. I was reading it, and I have a 14-year-old, and she's like, I always see your face in that book. And I was like, yes, and you're going to do yoga with me on Friday night. And she was like, right. So I'm trying to get her there. But I really was struck by this idea, I think it's around page 135, where you say kind of self-care is a choice, right? And so how do so many of us not make that choice, right? And how do we move to making that choice and acknowledging kind of how this fits into our struggle as people who are activists?
Thank you so much for that question. So I have a horrible memory. Don't let that get out to people. So I create a lot of acronyms. And one of the things that I created is an acronym CLAP. You need to learn to clap for yourself. That wellness is a choice, it's a lifesaver, and it's an active practice. What I'm also very clear about is that we don't choose our environment. So again, looking at public health as a model to understand, you can say, well, you didn't choose to drink water today, right? These are the things that keep us well. Well, if you are in Flint, Michigan, or you're in Texas, you don't have the choice to have fresh water, right? And so there's the things that we can control and the things that we can't control. And, you know, Du Bois asked, how does it feel to be a problem, right? Understanding that we look at people who aren't healthy as we are not making the right choices, right? And we are not acknowledging that some of us aren't always given the right damn choices, right? So, but I do think, you know, and it's not enough to say, well, we have a prison program of yoga. Well, what we need to be doing is really challenging the idea of imprisonment and looking at the pervasive systemic abuses of why these people are in prison, why solitary confinement is a thing, why political prisoners are, you know, and so it's not enough to just say, so let's just sit and, you know, but given the inevitable terribleness, the inevitable injustices that have been around since time immemorial, given that as a fact, what can we control? And that's when you go to narratives like Erica Huggins and Angela Davis and their understanding about, while unjustly imprisoned, what it means to take control, and how when you have limited choice options, you can still choose, but that is a practice. So it's not as simple as saying, well, you know, you just didn't choose to be well. Like, are you sure, sweetheart, you want to be well? It is really, that's a quote from Tony K. Bambar's Salt Eater, that, but every day we have to choose and learn to choose that it's okay to want to be well and to work towards that every day.
Absolutely. Thank you for contextualizing that choice, right? Because the way that we think about choice and our options within the availability of resources, and resources are time, they are energy, they are bandwidth, right? All of these things about how we choose to take care of ourselves. And I was really struck by the quote that you pulled out from Tony K. Bambara, right? Are you sure you want to be well? It's like, oh, that's it right there. Yeah. So are there any other questions or any final thoughts from our panelists?
Did Stephanie get to Laylee's inquiry about, like, where do you want this to go? What do you want to happen? You may have like ruminated on it, but if you wouldn't mind, I would love to know more about that part.
Yes, thank you so much. So, so as you know, the book rotates around 1975 and you know, being kind of the founding of the Yoga Journal. What I would like to happen is a number of things. The connection and community, Black women learning about the history, that it is okay to want to be well and to work for that. And that, as Angela Davis says, self-care is not just about the self, it's about collective wellness, collective well-being. So to create those communities, but also to challenge the narratives of spaces like Yoga Journal, which I called out, and they still had me, follow up to have a wonderful discussion, because there are certain voices that are excluded in the academic publishing world, the corporate world, the leaders. So you have Yoga Alliance, you have Yoga Journal, the mainstream, if you will, organizations that don't reflect the diversity of voices. And it's not as simple as saying, we're going to include you in this by having a feature. So for example, Yoga Journal hired Tamara Jeffries, right, from Bennett College, who is one of the leading voices. She's doing amazing work on Alice Coltrane's yoga history, right? A full, and has written a blog piece for Black Yoga Teachers Alliance as well. So it's beginning to institutionalize this history and these voices that I'm trying to amplify in these spaces, so that it no longer becomes acceptable, in journals, either academic journals or the academic publishing world, that we need y'all's book series to come out. You know who I'm looking at, you, right? Listen, we're talking. And so, and there are some voices that have been marginalized because they bring a critical analysis to, like Srina Gandhi's dissertation, right? She makes a lot of people uncomfortable because she's calling out the centrality of whiteness. And so as a result, that, the marginalization of some of the voices that are talking. So even though I'm talking about Black women, Black people's experiences, I think it's incredibly important to do that. And then as we're talking about understanding Blackness in different ways, that that we understand this as an inclusive practice. I always, I cite Janet Mock in the book as a Black trans woman, right? That we have to decenter our voices, and not, when I say women, I mean women broadly. And that has to be part of the discussion as well, that we all have things to learn. And so I want to see more voices institutionalized. But I also understand that, everything ain't for everybody, and some people don't want to be in these majority spaces. We want to either create our own or, again, have strategic silences.
Excellent. That brings us to 6:30. That sounds like a great note to end on. Dr. Evans, is there anything else you would like to add, and remind us one more time about the summer panel? Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you all so much. I'm proud of myself that I didn't cry during this panel, because I'm so much, very, very much in love with all of you, and so grateful for your work. Without your work, this would not exist. This is, this first read listening party is, envisioned to be a kind of a kickoff of broader discussions that will take place later on this year when the paperback comes out. And I want to engage international, like Township Yogi just came out as a kind of placing yoga in South Africa. And so I really want to connect to yogic traditions on the continent, to talk about yoga in North Africa, in East Africa and West Africa and South Africa, where each of these locations have traditions, what's going on in the Caribbean. And so Africana yoga as a and that's one thing that can happen now that we're all online. We can have these discussions. And I want people to read the book, like read my books. I'm trying to get one of my little, I'm on the Twitter, and I'm trying to get some tweet something to like hit live, right? To just go viral or whatever they call it. And then I can just say, read my books. Because that's really what I want. I want people to read the books, engage the books, cite the books, and hopefully just get what I've gotten from books. Because I know, as I say in the coda, I'm not going to be here forever. None of us will. But to have these ideas live on, and people read my book, like I read Anna Julia Cooper's book that was published in 1892, A Voice from the South by a Black Woman of the South. That is that beyond body spiritual connection. So yes, I would like this to continue, just to be a part of the discussion. So thank you again very much.
All right, thank you all, and thank you all for joining us. I urge you to pop over and join us for yoga with Dominique Harmon next. It has been wonderful being on with you all. Thank you.